Hello, everyone. Welcome in. Thank you all so much for coming to this webinar on the role of the labor movement in solidarity economy. This event came about for several reasons. First, as Bruce Richard pointed out at the Jackson Rising book talk last month at 1199, we're getting our asses kicked, and we need to figure out new ways to come together to fight back against capitalism, authoritarianism, and rising fascism amid this time of climate breakdown, systematic racism, and institutional failure. Second, having the opportunity to be in class with Rebecca Lurie, the intersection between unions, co-ops, and solidarity economy is a frequent topic. But in many cases, we end up talking past each other. So hopefully this discussion can advance points of unity and collective strategy. Before getting started, I want to make a few announcements. First, I want to thank CUNY School of Labor and Urban Studies, the SLU Student Union, the Solidarity Economy Club, and my classmates in the fieldwork class who have helped me develop the ideas behind this discussion. A special thanks to Michael Lalane at Public Programming for helping us set up the webinar, Abby Harper and Katie Fireman for providing support on the back end, and most especially to Rebecca Lurie for supporting me through this process and being there every step of the way. The layout of this event will follow with an introduction from Rebecca Lurie, followed by talks from each panelist for about 15 minutes. The speaking order will be Dr. Jessica Gordon Nembhard, followed by Shaywaal Amin and Dr. Alexander Kolokotronis. Then we'll go to Q&A. As a student-led event, we want to prioritize the questions of SLU students. So if you're a SLU student, please identify yourself with your question, and we'll put it at the top of the list. Throughout this event, you can add your questions to the Q&A box, and we will follow up during the Q&A period. Now I'm going to introduce the speakers, then give it away to Rebecca for further introduction. Jessica Gordon Nembhard is author of Collective Courage, A History of African-American Cooperative Economic Thought and Practice, and 2016 inductee into the Cooperative Hall of Fame. Jessica Gordon Nembhard is Professor of Community Justice and Social Economic Development in the Department of Africana Studies at John Jay College in the City University of New York. Jessica is internationally recognized and widely published political economist specializing in cooperative economics, community economic development, Black political economy, and much more. Shaywaal Amin is Vice President of 1199 SEIU UHWE's Nursing Home Division. He's a dynamic union leader that has a proven history of successful contract negotiation and member strategy. Shaywaal is a graduate of Rutgers University Labor Management Studies, alumni 1990, as well as a recent graduate of Mel King Fellowship at MIT Co-op Lab. His 31-year tenure at 1199 SEIU, Shaywaal has serviced and organized thousands of workers into the union and has been an integral part of community organizing and cooperative campaigns. Shaywaal is, on top of being a union organizer, Shaywaal is a poet, enthusiastic activist, and visionary organizer who has spent time in West African countries of Gambia and Senegal doing work with Operation Crossroads. Alexander Kolokotronis is director of Naugatuck Valley Project. Naugatuck Valley Project has 23 member organizations, including 8 churches, a mosque, and numerous labor unions. Alex is also director of MVP's Community Land Trust arm, through which he stewards and supports 6 limited equity housing cooperatives. Prior to MVP, Alex worked at the Connecticut AFL-CIO, supporting union affiliates representing 250,000 union members and co-running a statewide election program that successfully swept labor union members into the state legislature. He recently completed a PhD at Yale University in political science. Alex is also one of the leaders of the Emerson's Tenants Union, recently formed in downtown New Haven. Welcome all, and I'm going to pass it over to Rebecca for further introduction.
Thank you so much, Rob. I'm going to do a little screen share. Well, I welcome everybody. I want to also invite people to introduce themselves in the Q&A as a way for us to sort of capture who's who. Can you see that screen okay? Seems like a few other things are showing. So for those who are from other places, and I've noticed as far away as Germany and the West Coast, different places in the States, City University of New York is quite large. 250,000 people are attached. We'd like to say everybody loves somebody at CUNY. And the newest and still a very small college is called the School of Labor and Urban Studies, that came about after about 40 years of being an institute called the Joseph M. Murphy Institute for Labor. So at our school, we have two basic departments. We have labor studies and urban studies. And the history of being a labor studies department is long. It partnered with the labor unions, and urban studies through a number of partnerships we've had around New York City. So these are our two departments. They each have master's programs. Urban studies has an undergraduate program, and they both have a number of certificate programs. The certificate program called the Advanced Certificate in Workplace Democracy and Community Ownership, we call WEDCO or WDCO, is really focused on cooperative economics or solidarity economy. And it is parked inside the Urban Studies department. I'm faculty at Urban Studies. And that's always been a little bit of a, oh, maybe labor, oh, maybe urban. It's all these issues for social justice. So we're really excited to have this event today. And may I say that this really grew out of a student-led series of initiatives that includes being the first student club called the Solidarity Economy Club under our student union. So thank you, Rob, for pulling this together, and Abby and Katie, who are behind the scenes, also founding members of the club. So I think I want to share this paradigm or this perspective that I really live by. I call it the fight and build perspective. I'm not the only one. A lot of us are talking about this. Rob referenced a conversation that was at 1199 about a month ago, where Talia Kuno spoke a lot about the fight and build. In this strategy framework for just transition, we can look at the extractive economy and the living economy. And I like to say the extractive economy is what we fight. And a lot of us spend a lot of time fighting. And may we shout out to the solidarity to Gaza right now as a militarism that we are fighting in solidarity with the folks on the ground. And understanding that we fight so many systems. We also want to build the world we want to see. And this is the perspective of really an economy that's a living economy, one that really builds on things like caring and well-being and integrating with the ecology, deep democracy, and not least of which is work and cooperation. And I'll go back here just to say work here looks like exploitation. And our labor movement really grew out of fighting this kind of exploitation. And the cooperative, the worker co-op movement and other co-ops are looking at how we build cooperation. We can look at systems that look local, national, and international that we can try to influence as we make that change. But one of the most important things I'd like to say and share is that there's a values filter here. And that values filter as we fight is really going into what we want to build with things like a deep commitment to racial justice and social equity, a shift in economic control to communities. It means community power, democratic wealth in the workplace, advanced ecological restoration, relocalized production and consumption, retain and restore cultures and traditions. And I want to honor all of those things. And may I say, we are coming to you from Lenape territory here in what is otherwise the Northeast of the United States of America, but understanding that the whole planet had indigenous people living in different places. And the forced migration that colonization gave us has brought us to this point where we have a lot to build and reclaim. So I wanted to offer that framework because for me, it really helps to set the stage for we have a lot of work ahead of us. And as the indigenous people from the Haudenosaunee, this part of the planet, would say in their teaching, we do things by 7 generations, and we think of our decisions, what's going to impact 7 generations ahead. And we can also look back 7 generations. And when we look forward 7 generations, we might say we really can build a world that we believe in that looks like the regenerative economy. There's plenty of fight. I want to, again, shout out to all the encampments of the college students around the globe right now that are taking on that fight and come back and say, so what do we build? Some of it happens in those encampments as people come up with common frameworks for the principles upon which they stand, and maybe even who's cooking the food so they can eat each day. So there's so many ways that we think about that living economy and the cooperative economy we want to move towards. So let me turn it over to Jessica. Am I right? Jessica is the first speaker. And
Yes.
again, thank you, Rob.
Thanks so much, Rebecca. That was a great, giving us great context. I am going to be speaking about solidarity economics, labor, and Black American co-op history. I also do, though, want to start with acknowledgements, right? The original stewards of the land and the need to honor treaties, acknowledging Mother Earth and our efforts to keep her sustainable and our planet livable. I also want to acknowledge the African origins of all humanity, the consequences of racial capitalism and settler colonialism, as we will be talking about and as Rebecca already mentioned, but also acknowledge the struggles and the resistance, right, and the rebuilding and using solidarity, mutual aid, cooperation for rebuilding and for liberation. So thanks everyone for having me. Welcome any elders, and let me start. Somebody might need to tell me when I have like 5 minutes left, because I think I probably have too much to say, but I'll try to consolidate it. Rebecca already said a little bit about some of what I want to say about economics and labor. But let me start with 3 takeaways that I hope you'll get from my presentation. One, that solidarity economies, including mutual aid and cooperative economics, are the humane answer to achieving economic and environmental justice, and they help us to address racial, gender, and other inequalities. Also, we need to honor women's labor and caring work as the basis and backbone of solidarity economies, recognizing especially the role of women of color that enable us to sustain and expand our solidarity economic ecosystems and practices. And then third, that we need to recognize human labor as the source of economic development, as well as the source of human well-being, that we need to embrace and dignify the sovereignty of labor in our economic structures, and that will also help to move us toward achieving what I like to call an economics of abundance, which is, I think, what we're all trying to get to. So very quickly, why do we need solidarity economics, right? We need it because we live in a world of racial and gendered capitalism, which maximizes profit at the expense of labor, people, and Mother Earth. And it talks about and practices economics as the management of scarcity, which disproportionately exploits people of color, women, LGBTQIA plus people, and the environment. And so we need, obviously, we've got multiple challenges, intersecting challenges of climate change, ecological destruction, as well as unemployment, poverty, wealth inequality, persistent gender, racial, ethnic inequality and discriminations, rampant violence and war. We continue to privatize and enclose and take over, right? Growing fascism, all the other issues we know that are wrong. And really a lot of the underlying conditions, right, our inhumane economy is because of we're in a racialized, gendered capitalist system. And so to understand solidarity economics and how we get free and how we get out of it, we need to understand that economics in some way has been hijacked, right, by this neoclassical economics, by the practice of capitalism. And this, what we call the management of scarcity, meaning that, right, people have to fight over and minimize what we can accomplish because our resources are scarce and profits are supposedly scarce, right? And so then the notion is, so then who deserves the resources, who deserves the profits? And under capitalism, obviously, we have this notion that the returns go to capital, not to labor. And so we deny the majority people of access, right, by privatizing and enclosing. And we don't, and we glorify this notion that individual greed and private ownership is what keeps the economy going, when that's not really what happens. I don't think I need to explain profit maximization, but just quickly, right, it's the focus on bringing in more income above your costs, but the costs are human labor, right? Natural resources, land. And so the notion is that you can minimize costs and exploit human labor and land, et cetera, in order to maximize profits. And that's the driving force of economics, is the system that we're in. That also creates obviously class inequality and creates a whole set of mythologies, right, to maintain this system and to try to justify this system. So racism, class issues, inequality, all get explained away as necessary sort of collateral damage, right? But what if we change our focus from profit maximizing to maximizing human potential? My friend Curtis Haynes and I have been talking about this in the last few years, especially. So we talk about maximizing human energy, right? And what's human energy? It's the energy that we expand in order to reproduce and sustain ourselves as human beings. And it's also the energy we expend to produce innovations to help us keep perfecting our social reproduction and our sustenance so that we have prosperity and leisure. And it helps us to address racial and gender exploitation if we think about, right, that the sovereignty is the human energy, the labor, the work that we put in. And we also put in energy into education and practice toward liberation, right? Because that's what being a human being is about, making life better for ourselves and our family and our neighbors. And solidarity economics obviously pulls that all together, right? And reminds us that we're doing this to help each other, to be a stronger society, to work together. We can also think about this social human energy and social reproduction on two paths. I use Lloyd Hogan's from his work on the Black political economy. He talks about the internal and the external labor markets. So the internal is that the social reproduction, the way we support family, the things we do that's not in the market, that's not necessarily for pay, but it's still actually work, which we often don't think about. It's the caring work, it's the human relationship building, and the social reproduction. And then there's the external labor market, which is where we work for wages in the capitalist system. We're working under in markets, right? We're competing with other people to get that work and to get those wages. But we need to recognize that both systems operate. And again, I'll get more into solidarity economics, but solidarity economics tries to combine them, right? Instead of having them so separate, right? Capitalism totally separates it. In fact, they don't really care what we do in the internal labor market as long as it doesn't impact or hurt their profits or stop us from being in the labor market. But we also don't necessarily, and feminist economics and other kinds of economics have tried to say we need to care about the caring part of society, because actually capitalism doesn't work if we're not doing this caring and social reproduction in the background, even though it doesn't value it. So how do we start to value it? How do we start to recognize that that's where the real power, the real engine of economics is? I also often like to talk about community as also labor, because sometimes people think of community as separate from workers and separate from labor. But again, community is just a community of workers, a community of laborers, because all human beings are laborers. We all expend human energy to reproduce ourselves and to create prosperity and leisure, right? But I think what we're against when people think about being against work or labor, it's against capitalist work and capitalist labor, right? Really working for other capitalists and even working for so-called nonprofit organizations. That's where the exploitation is, right? That's what's bad about labor, because it's our work and our value is either undervalued and what we are producing is going to enhance other people and not back to enhancing us and our families and our communities. So I think we need to start redefining and reformulating those kind of understandings. And then we can also see economics in a new way, right? Instead of this managing scarcity and protecting private property, economics is really about production, right? How we reproduce ourselves, what we make, how we make it, how we nurture and preserve ourselves, how we value the work and the energy that we put in to that kind of sustenance, and then how we exchange the goods and services um, among each other, how we work among each other, and then how do we regulate those things? And we don't have to regulate them through competitive markets, through capitalist markets that are seeking profit maximization. We can regulate them through cooperation, consensus, solidarity. Um, and so we can rethink about economics as what some of us call an economics of abundance. And that's what solidarity economies are also trying to produce. We work where work is fun and good. We collectively control it. We do it with others. There's no scarcity. There's not a zero-sum game. There's no exploitation, right? Then what we create and produce is actually endless in some senses, right? Because we're creative, innovative people. We can do with what we have, and we can create more if we're given that freedom to do that. If we're not being exploited and used, as tools for other people's betterment. And that's really what I kind of say, an economics of abundance leads us to liberation. To, as I said, those goals and goals of economic democracy, economic justice, racial justice, gender justice, right? We can follow and get to those humane goals by reasserting our notion of economic democracy, economic justice, cooperation, and solidarity. I've also been arguing that economic cooperation and solidarity economics were actually the first forms of economic engagement that human beings were involved in, right? We all cooperated, we worked together, we helped each other to survive in the early years of human beings, of Homo sapiens coming. And so solidarity economics in some ways returning us to those traditions, to those legacies, and highlighting them, as well as highlighting the ways that ordinary everyday people work together and have solidarity both against capitalism, but also for, again, this development of humanity. So part of this is about resistance and operating against things, but it's also, as Rebecca said, it's about building. And so some examples. Oh, and the last thing I wanted to say about this sense of building and coming together is how important it is that we recognize that this is joyful work, right? This is about human beings surviving and thriving and working together and enjoying it. And we actually have some data that shows that human beings create endorphins when they cooperate, that women actually get even more endorphins and long-lasting endorphins when they cooperate. So it also, I think, helps to explain why some of us have noticed women are in the solidarity movement and the co-op movements even more than men sometimes. But this quiet joy, as one study called it, I think is really important for us because, again, so often when we think about economics, when we think about work, we think about it as being a burden, right? Burden and horrible, and it's something we have to do, but nobody wants to do. And so I'm also kind of advocating for not only that we change the way that we think about economies and think about work, but we change how we feel about it, right? And really recognize this as a way to bring joy back into our lives and into the ways that we relate to other people. So solidarity economics, right? It's a tool to do that, to gain justice, sustainability, a democratic economy, right? It provides us a way of thinking about the economy from the ground up, about how do we bring prosperity, joy, leisure to everybody, and how do we work together, right? And this recognition that collective action and working together makes a better world, and providing this lens of non-hierarchical economic relations, right? We don't have to be profit maximizing in order to be economically successful, right? We don't have to exploit the land. We don't have to exploit people in order for us to sustain ourselves economically and to create prosperity. And so solidarity economics is that combination of, again, being against something, against neoliberalism and capitalism and global capitalism, but also for these grounded processes of cooperation, anti-oppression, non-hierarchical economic relationships, and recognizing and valuing the things that people are already do toward this better vision, right? And recognizing that all of us and all of our multiple hats that we wear and stuff, we're always doing acts of solidarity, of economic solidarity. Often they're hidden. Sometimes we don't even recognize them as that, but I'm here to say that we need to kind of remind ourselves that we practice everyday acts of economic solidarity, and that's what makes us human. And so being able to assert that even more as we go on really matters. So the final thing I want to talk about is a couple of examples of what that means. So I've been studying particularly African American co-ops and the co-op movement in the United States. The the hidden roles of African Americans in the cooperative movement in the United States. And what I found was that there was a strong but hidden co-op movement. It was connected to civil rights, the long civil rights movement, meaning the whole 400 years of resistance to enslavement and racial discrimination. It's always been a partner with our efforts for liberation. I think, again, because solidarity and cooperation are these natural human processes, right? We practiced it in Africa before we were forcibly brought here. We were able to retain some of those notions. There's a really interesting quote from W.E.B. Du Bois. He said, "The spirit of revolt, which tried to cooperate by means of insurrection, led to widespread organizing for the rescue of fugitive slaves among Negroes themselves and developed into various cooperative efforts." So he's seeing this connection between revolt, insurrection, right, resistance, and cooperation, right? We couldn't be successful at insurrection and revolt if we didn't cooperate, if we didn't have collective action. But then as we use collective action to revolt and resist, we also realized that collective action cooperation would help us to be economically emancipated. And he said, so these growing efforts actually led to cooperative businesses, building and loans association and trade unions, right? All these connected because, again, it was part of our understanding as human beings of what things could happen collectively and in solidarity. I found 3 prolific periods of Black co-ops in the US. One was the 1880s, one was the 1930s and 40s, one was the 1960s and 70s, and actually probably we're in one right now in the 2020s. The 1880s and the 1930s had survival needs in common. The economy was under assault in both cases. Also, the 1880s and the 1960s were periods of racial consciousness and transition and Black power sort of movements. In the 1880s, it was more Black populist movement, but there was some level of Black power also. The 1880s and the 1960s also saw the need for economic independence in order to be politically active and in order to fight for civil rights and economic rights. And then all 3 periods had a lot of strong Black organizations that were focused on economic liberation, not just policy change and social justice, but economic justice and deliberate co-op development. I'll just finish with 2 more examples. The 1880s, I'll say a little bit more about them because we're now in a similar period of backlash and growing fascism. The 1880s, some of you might know, was the rise of the Ku Klux Klan. It was the start of the Jim Crow segregation or apartheid era in the United States, but it was also the beginning of labor unions and organized labor in coalition with populists, with women's rights and with civil rights organizations, and the growing co-op movement. So all these interlocking liberation movements were actually operating together in the 1880s. And the labor unions were talking about these we're talking about co-op ownership, that's the way for the sovereignty of labor and for workers to own their own cooperatives. They were connecting with civil rights and integrationists and women's rights movements. And so it's really interesting to see that all these modern, what we think of in the 20th century as modern movements were really working together and started together, even though, by the early 1900s, labor was kind of racist and segregationist, and the women's rights movement was kind of separate from the civil rights movements, et cetera. But but if you look back on that period, it's really an amazing period of coalition and ecosystem building and connecting movements. And then my final example, and I know in the Q&A we'll get into maybe some more of my examples, but I also wanted to talk about the role of the Ladies Auxiliary to the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters in the 30s and 40s. The Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, some of you might know, was basically our first major 20th century independent Black union, started by A. Philip Randolph and some other sleeping car porters, and were enabled sleeping car porters and the maids that worked in the trains to get real decent middle class wages in the Black community. The Ladies Auxiliary was technically supposed to help keep morale up, recruit members to the union, that kind of thing, but they took it upon themselves very early on with their president, Helena Wilson, to do economic development, consumer economics and cooperative economics, because they understood how important it was to keep good labor wages recirculating in communities, and that the only way to do that was through cooperatives. They started study groups, at least 17 study groups in different chapters all over the country and in Canada. They started consumer rights and cooperative economics studying and training. They started some credit unions, food co-ops, did coalitions with other organized labor. And so again, they understood it wasn't good enough just to have a strong labor union and maybe middle class wages. It was important to really move toward economic justice and do economic cooperation at every level and in any way possible. And so I'll leave that so you'll hear from my other partners here, and then I'll look forward to the Q&A. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Jessica, for laying the table and giving that history lesson. I really appreciate that. Again, and thank you very much to CUNY, Rob and Rebecca for inviting me to speak to the future, speak to the intelligentsia of the United States around where we are. When we think about it, we have actually in the last 4 years have had a paradigm shift. Industrial capitalism now moving to a techno, what I call an advancement where capital consolidation amongst a few men and not being able to, or trickle it down to the workers. And we have more questions and challenges that we have answers. And I wanted to open that up by saying that the idea that where I am in 1199 SEIU is that we are in a fight for our lives. The healthcare and long-term care, as you know, it's shifted. The decentralizing of hospitals have gone now more into community services. Nursing homes are splitting into what is called privatizations or networks, whereby we as a union have to now shift. So that within the last 50 years, what we have gained, we have seen we had to make concessions in order to maintain what we have. And so 1199 now is faced with an issue around collective bargaining, the issue whereby we moved now to pressure the state to bring monies into the employers, for that matter, to trickle down, if you will, to the workers. And so something wrong with that dynamic. And we need to think about why we need to shift not only the political idea, but the economic idea of the workers. That we do not need to go to the employer anymore now, it's to go to the government, which in terms of healthcare, that gives 90% or more of what is called the cash or the reimbursements to the healthcare institutions. When we think about the idea of regulations, it sort of stifles or it stifles the idea of talking about what we are here to talk about, the solidarity economy, co-ops. It stifles it because it caters to this idea that workers can't do it themselves. It has to be done by the boss, and the boss then comes and tells us what to do. And so our whole relationship with that we're still boxed in, and we need to move those walls away to start thinking about it from a team perspective, or for that matter, the solidarity economy? How do we anchor the union into our communities? The pandemic showed us that in healthcare, by the way, I hope we all believe this, that healthcare is a right for all human beings. And that's what we want to push. Part of our agenda and our long-term strategy here as part of the exploratory committee is to push healthcare as a right for all human beings. But staffing is the biggest crisis right now in healthcare, as it is the fastest and largest growing industry in America. It is lacking, quote unquote, people wanting to come in or to be a healthcare worker. And so what we saw in the last 4 years because of COVID is that the employers now are saying, well, wait, we don't have enough workers. However, what they are doing is to beat the union, they create agencies and structures that allows them as capitalists to make money outside of the union, going around the union contract because of a crisis, quote unquote. And then the issue of privatization. Just to put it into skate, I represent 6,500 workers for 5 organizers. We have in the long-term care division of 1199, 22 different employers that were mostly not-for-profit modeled employers. Over the last 10 years, we've seen, in my area, we went from 22 employers that were not-for-profit to 19 within 10 years that are now privatized for-profit organizations in healthcare. My area, we have the largest nursing homes, if not probably the networks in the United States. Places like Isabella, New Jewish Home, networks that have 740 beds as part of their company. And so we've seen that change, that the one missing piece outside of the union's political pressure is the workers coming together in their communities, demanding more governance, demanding more profit sharing, demanding that the idea of how we deal business is no longer the boss coming to tell us what to do, that we have the answers amongst ourselves. As a matter of fact, in my sphere, mostly 80% of the workforce are women with children who run their households, who understand the dynamic of creating what is called the share the money, the susus, the idea of taking the money to as they say, I have to save some for today to get to tomorrow. And our members know how to do that best. 7 years ago, we created an exploratory committee for unionized cooperatives, which was the vision of our executive vice president, Yvonne Armstrong. I myself, she had visited Mondragon. I myself worked with a think tank before coming to 1199 called the Labor Research Association that was looking at ESOPs and co-ops in Quebec, Canada, and understood that we needed somewhere now to how do we counter what is happening in our industry. And so we created an exploratory committee going forward with getting one member or one staff in particular areas of our union, research, legal, the organizers themselves, education, in these different departments to come together to start talking about how and why and the need for changing the dynamic in healthcare. As you know, there is a move towards home care, right, which is another piece of the puzzle here, because the federal government is funding more in-home, keep your family into the homes. So it has a push when it comes to the nursing home industry. However, it does not mean that nursing homes are going out of business. What it means is that many of these operators in New York City in particular, and in Long Island and in Brooklyn, are looking at the real estate. The real estate is key. So they keep it for 10 years. They get engaged with the idea of healthcare. and then they sell it out for condos, and then or selling out to another partner for privatization. And so that's what we see currently in my sphere. So our committee has gone through several different, I want to say, aches and pains in terms of engaging not only employers, but our members in the idea of the cooperative movement and the solidarity economy. I wanted to say I saw there's a saying, I think by a Belgian by the name of Wole Akomo, I think that's his name, that says the solidarity economy is, how do I say that? Is like one hand clapping if we don't have the economic justice. I kind of said that a little paraphrase, but the reality is that we need the social justice and the economic justice to make this thing happen. And so our committee has gone to several conferences. We've attracted the ICA group to start to think about how do we do conversions, how do we think about educating, and how do we think about developing a research strategy around co-ops. We established 4 committees: a training education committee, a strategic partnership, of which I want to talk a little bit more about, where the Cooperative Economic Alliance in New York City, working with them in an idea, I will talk about that down the line. Research and development, which we have actually a sociologist, researchers working with us to look at the entire 1199's ocean. 1199 is also in Massachusetts, New Jersey, New York, Boston, Maryland, and Florida. Baltimore, Maryland, and Florida. And so we are looking to now have discussions with these areas on thinking about how to work on conversions, how to dissect the ideas of looking at ways to, through contract negotiations, to put in the idea of profit sharing within these negotiations, and teaching our members about the solidarity economy. And then 4th, a business plan, working with the ICA to put together a broader plan, something that we are looking at called the Innovative Center for Unionized Co-ops, an ICOP, that would be a lobbying entity, would be a fundraising entity, as well as a strategic partner entity and an educational entity for not just 1199, but for also the broader community. Just talking a little bit about the idea that the strategic partnership that we are engaging in with CUNY, the Cooperative Economic Alliance in New York City, we have looked at Co-op City, which is the largest housing development, and we are looking at it now in New York, and perhaps maybe in the United States, that is a co-op or have that concept. And we have thousands of members living there. So we have another thing, actually an article, I look at it as a jewel in the rough. There is an organization called CHCA, which is called the Cooperative Home Care Associates, Cooperative CHCA. And they are the largest cooperative organization or business in the United States. We have decided that we want to team the largest cooperative, worker co-op, unionized co-op, and the largest housing co-op, city, co-op city, with CHCA to do the first experiment, to see if how our members, engaging our retirees, engaging our members in co-op city into understanding the solidarity economy through trainings. We've done a survey, and we'll continue to do a survey with the members and the broader communities in Co-op City, but also making them understand that there is a broader solidarity economy, that there's a food, and there's internet, and there's credit unions, and there are housing, other cooperatives that we can circulate, both not only in terms of our members, but that we can keep and anchor our communities strong by creating quality jobs, training, and for that matter, getting CHCA's worker owners into these homes in Co-op City. So as a matter of fact, just for quick advertisement, next Thursday, we're doing our first meet and greet, whereby we're going to be doing solidarity economy workshops with the residents of Co-op City, also getting them in terms of the surveys, getting them to fill out the surveys, but also doing a sort of a political push. We want to also push the political, the legislatures in that area in the Bronx to start talking about the housing issue, to duplicating Co-op City, if you will, to talk a little bit more about when it comes to healthcare, the right to first refusal, whereby that a nursing home cannot be sold to a for-profit without first dealing with the workers. We want the ability to have the profit sharing options through our collective bargaining. And that is going to take a moment because we want to do training with Rebecca and CUNY. Hopefully we can begin doing this within the summer into the fall around training our staff, training our members and our delegates and our leaders to go into the communities, to start talking, to knocking on doors, to talk about the idea of the solidarity economy. So that is one of our long-term strategies when it comes to dealing with the strategic partnership with CUNY. Our ability, by the way, and I think I must say this, part of this is not just for 1199. I believe that unions, 32BJ, Teamsters, CWA, need to now come together and start thinking about how do we sort of fund the solidarity economy by creating a trust fund or creating an ability to have a capital. The unions can not only just give a political platform, but have an economic platform to develop cooperatives and develop more on housing and develop garden spaces and food cooperatives within the inner cities and for that matter within our state. So that is one of the long-term ideas that we have going forward. In terms of why co-ops, so I look at it, co-ops are just as a tool in the toolbox for our union to counter just not only privatization, but to understand, get the workers involved in more governance within their communities, anchoring healthcare. If there's one thing that all of us will have an issue with within the next 20 years, or for that matter now, it is going to be healthcare. And we need to have more of a voice in where our healthcare monies go. And I believe that the solidarity economy, I believe that the cooperatives, and in particular 1199's political agenda as well as platform, both to bring that social justice and that economic justice in one. And I believe that we are on our way to doing that, to the ability to creating wealth sharing, profit sharing, and community empowerment. That is what we are in the business of doing. And I believe that the 1199's ability in New York to push this across, not just in New York, is doable. I see it in Baltimore, Maryland, that there is a push there to privatize many of the nursing homes, many long-term cares. And we want to be able now to make sure the abilities that we're dealing with here, that we take it down to Maryland and to Baltimore. Healthcare depends mostly on federal and state monies, as I said before. And I believe that co-ops would give a democratic governance or co-op model around the ability to influence government to bring it back into our communities. It would give workers the ability to hold on to their jobs, quality jobs, better wages. As a matter of fact, being able to even pick who is the boss. And not only that, in terms of healthcare, when we look at our communities throughout the cities, throughout the inner city, we think about the social deterrences of health, right? We would be able to address those ideas if we had more governance, we had more power within our community and using the platform of cooperatives. We would be able to address the food issue, the housing, and for that matter, social services, and healthcare. So to me, co-ops would address the reversal of the corporate top-down power, bringing collectivism into the arena and redesigning what we think our America should look like. I don't know, Robert, if I'm coming close to time or if I'm over time. But just to say that what we are, our journey, we have questions, we have challenges, but I believe with the strength of the workers and the strength of the working class, we can move those walls out of our way and build a new society. I move to Alex.
Great. Thank you everyone for having me here. I'm going to have a little bit of a slideshow on us at the Naugatuck Valley Project. I will say that the Naugatuck Valley Project has 23 member organizations, which include 8 churches, a mosque, 6 housing co-ops, which I will get to, and a number of labor unions as well. One of them is actually SEIU 1199 Northeast, which we work closely together with on pushing for a community benefits agreement at Waterbury Hospital, which I think is very connected to a lot of what we're talking about here, especially as we continue to iron out what could be the concretes of a community benefits agreement push. If we could bring up the slideshow, I can talk a little bit through Naugatuck Valley Project and how this relates to a number of the topics that we're talking about here or touching upon here. As you see, a big focus right now with us is tenants unions and housing cooperatives. And I will get to that in a moment. But to move on to the next slide, this is a book on the Naugatuck Valley Project, Banded Together, Economic Democratization, the Brass Valley. It's by Jeremy Brecker. A number of you all might be familiar with Jeremy Brecker, who wrote a pretty reputable book called Strike. But Jeremy Brecker is actually from the region and wrote this really great history and ethnography of the Naugatuck Valley Project's first 25 years. And so NVP formed in 1983 as a response to deindustrialization in the valley. As is in the title of the book, the Naugatuck Valley, of which the biggest town or city for Connecticut is Waterbury, was the sort of brass capital of the world. Brass products were being created in the valley, and there were 50,000 manufacturing jobs. People from all around the world immigrated to the valley and constituted a big chunk of the workforce there in the early and mid part of the 20th century. But as is the story for much of the Northeast, deindustrialization began in the 60s, 70s, into the 80s, and into the 90s. And so NVP was formed as a response to that. How is it that we're going to respond to this loss of jobs and more than the loss of jobs, the breaking apart of community and the social fabric tied to that? And so what the NVP essentially was at the beginning, or has been, was a partnership between the United Auto Workers, the Catholic Archdiocese, and the Lutheran Diocese to try and address these factory closures that were occurring by actually converting factories and firms in the valley into worker co-ops. And so for a period in the United States, actually, the biggest worker co-op was Seymour Specialty Wire, which was based in the valley. And even in situations where there wasn't success in pushing for the conversion of factories into co-ops, what did occur was, at minimum, the saving of the retirement incomes of 3,000 workers in the valley. And so that was the first 10, 15 years of what NVP did. But as you see, as outlined here, there's a number of things a number of ways in which we continue to operate as a kind of labor community faith organization. Our board is representative of that. You will find on our board people who have been union stewards, union presidents, pastors, people from the wider immigrant and migrant community, And we focus on currently environmental justice work, domestic worker organizing. I saw in the chat that somebody is here from the National Domestic Workers Alliance. NVP is an affiliate of the National Domestic Workers Alliance. We had helped spearhead actually a victory in winning a domestic workers bill of rights, and we just won the expansion of paid sick days to cover all workers, which will include domestic workers. That's going to be rolled out over the course of a few years, but we're pretty happy about that victory at the statewide level, and are part of a statewide domestic worker coalition. And we work on affordable housing, and as I was mentioning, the hospital. And if we can go to the next slide, our affordable housing work is really right now focused on tenant organizing. And in a way, this is actually returning to the roots of what NVP has done as well. But before I get to that, how do we understand what a tenant is? And it touches upon why we're here talking about cooperatives, right? It's who's in control and who isn't. Essentially, when we look at it, tenants don't have control over their housing. And so even when we talk about work like mobile home park organizing, which is becoming a bigger thing as well in the region, while mobile home park owners own their manufactured home, they don't own the land underneath them. And so there's a relationship of tenancy there as well. Go to the next slide. If we understand it that way, what are tenants unions and essentially, again, what we're talking about is an organized association of tenants formed to protect their rights and interests and acting in common. And so a sort of larger vision around that is to moving towards joint or shared control of that housing. And there's certain tactical tools that we've used that are listed below here. But the next slide. This takes us, though, to what we've done at NVP. So at the same time that we were working on worker co-ops in the 80s, in the late 1980s, due to some changes in federal legislation, there were condo conversions happening all around the country. And what was the result of that was actually the jacking up of rent, people being pushed out of their buildings, out of their apartments. And this was happening in Waterbury and was ID'd among the worker owners that NVP had been in touch with. And so the response to that was to organize a tenants union in the late 80s. And what that looked like was trying to fight back against the rent increases. The rent increases skyrocketed around 300% over the course of just a few years. And it made for a very high profile fight. The mayor, U.S. senators, Congress people, state senators were all wrapped up in this fight and audiences to this fight. And so while the rent increases weren't successfully combated, and there's a longer story there, what was built was regional political power around building housing co-ops. And so NVP mobilized its tenants union, affiliate groups, again, number of unions, churches, and so on, to engage in a letter writing campaign, picketing. You'll see the picket here on the right. It's at the top, the mid right. You'll see in that poster board. There was phone banking, and again, not just in Waterbury, but around the entire Naugatuck Valley. And when to get a visual of that, that is around 15, 16 municipalities. And that was to secure city land and state bonding, state financing, to build 6 limited equity housing co-ops. And so you'll see that here on the left. These are the 6 limited equity housing co-ops. They're combined 102 units. Actually, until very recently, one of the leaders of that tenants union was a leader at the housing co-op. She unfortunately just passed, Evelyn Lush. And I had the fortune to work with her when I began at NVP. But our role as Naugatuck Valley Project is to serve as a continued sort of advocacy arm, a technical assistance arm, which we engage through our community land trust, the Naugatuck Valley Housing Development Corporation, which includes members of the NVP board, includes board members from each of the housing co-ops, and other public interest representatives. And so right now we're really engaged with promoting the model. The most that people pay currently at Brookside is $750 a month for a 4-bedroom. It's been a pretty big shock for people to hear that in Connecticut. It's probably a pretty big shock for anyone here on this call to hear that, but it's a financially sound complex. And a lot of my role and our role is in our technical assistance is to engage in trainings. The co-ops are kind of hybrid or quasi self-managed. And so, I'm not a property manager, and Weston MVP are not property managers. What we're there to do is to help people run their co-ops. And I think one of the issues that we've had in the United States actually is that we've often seen these sort of periodic cycles of co-ops getting very, very popular. A bubble kind of bursts around them. We have this expectation that co-ops will just figure it out on their own, and we don't build out a second-tier structure that is staffed, that has real capacity to support individual co-ops and support the growth of an entire sector. And when you look at other sort of housing co-op or worker co-op sectors, I started out myself in worker co-ops. What you'll see is that there are co-op sectors that are capable of supporting each other or having a kind of semi-autonomy. In fact, if you look to Sweden, 41% of multifamily homes are co-ops. So it's possible to reach real growth, real sizable growth. And that's what we sort of need to figure out. We need to learn from our history and learn from the histories of elsewhere as to how we can actually grow a sector that has real power and that can really benefit and sustain people. And what was just mentioned around cooperative home care associates in Co-op City. Co-op City, that was sort of a penultimate project of Abraham Kazan, who was a leader in the housing co-op movement and came out of the labor movement at a point where unions were really the leaders in building housing co-ops in New York City, many of which those co-ops still exist and are tied together. But the vision of Abraham Kazan was for the large cooperative complexes to essentially become not just a housing co-op, but to be an entire sort of community of cooperation among cooperatives. And so there were co-op grocery stores and so forth. And so to hear that this is something that 1199 is working on in New York City is really fantastic, because it's something that's a furthering of the vision of what it takes for us to really build a community that can support itself and not in the sort of environment that we've operated in, unfortunately, very widely, in which we're isolated from each other. And so at MVP, again, we started out doing worker co-ops and led us to housing co-ops, and housing co-ops is something that we're returning to. And this will be shared out in the link, but something that we're a part of as well in the Naugatuck Valley Project is a statewide labor community faith coalition as well, called Connecticut for All. And there are about 70 organizations in that. This is something that we talk about a lot. I just spoke at a rally this past Saturday about our housing cooperatives as we think about, similarly as was just spoken about how do we think about the state legislature? How do we think about financing and budgeting in the future? How do we think about raising revenue? What should that go towards? Should that be going towards sort of doing business as usual? Should that be going towards market rate development? Or should that be going towards cooperative housing and structures that support that cooperative housing? And so that's something that's become a part of our conversation in the state of Connecticut. And it's really, really fantastic to see. And to really relate it further, what we've also seen in that is sort of tying it even to my own personal situation, where I had to organize a tenants union in my building. I'm conducting this sort of talk right now from a hotel where I've lived in for 3 months because a pipe burst in my apartment. A landlord charged me rent illegally, engaged in illegal demolition with stop work order issued. And so we have been unable to get a proper, let alone any response, typically from our landlord. And we've had to organize a union. And one of the demands we put out publicly is to have a right of first refusal in a collective bargaining agreement. That is something that MVP did with workplaces, working together with the Bakers Union to put in place a right of first refusal within a collective bargaining agreement. And so relating that to this experience here is I can see, on the one hand, I'm helping to steward housing co-ops, and you can see the sort of, cooperation and cooperative economics can be complicated, but there is voice and there is power and there is say. And I can see in my own situation where where is the voice and where is the power, except in the collective action that we're taking as tenants. And so if we could move on to the next slide. There are policies, that we can engage in. In DC, there's Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act. It'd be wonderful if we had policies such as that as well. So what is it that we can, again, put in place? And to go to the next slide. This is sort of just our again, the 4 different areas or arenas in which we work in as Naugatuck Valley Project that I outlined earlier. But again, cooperatives are really, really important to us in terms of what we're thinking about moving into not just in the present and in our very much day-to-day present work, but into the future. And that's part of what we're doing now in the state of Connecticut. At the local level, it is organizing around it. Statewide is around really conducting education about how this works, how it can work, and to really articulate the intersection between, for example, the labor movement and co-ops. A number of our presidents of our co-ops are 1199 members. A number of the leaders of our co-ops are retired labor union members from different sectors, AFSCME, postal workers, and we can go on, teachers. So it's really important that as we're thinking about how, or not even as we're thinking about how we're tactically proceeding in really gelling the labor movement and the cooperative movement, we are articulating those very concrete, specific intersections because any good organizing starts from, it's cliched, but starts from the place of self-interest. And if we can articulate, hey, members, current active union members are a part of the co-op movement already, and we can grow what already exists. It's not something that's abstract and imagined. It's not something that we need to theorize as often to the future and that does not currently exist. But I can see it in the here and now that this is something that we have. And if we have this and we can see how current union members are empowered by this, then we can grow that further. And that's a way in which we've also grown the tenants union movement in Connecticut, where again, a number of the tenants union leader, I've been doing tenants union organizing for 5 years. I did it on a volunteer basis before I had this job. And again, a number of the ways in which we grew the profile of tenants union organizing was by articulating very specifically, very concretely, how tenants unions and members are labor union members and how that is a fertile ground for training up and building power between and across both. Then we can go to the next slide. I'm happy to keep engaging on this. I think what we need to do is grow a movement regionally. There's tons of great work happening in New York City. I came out of the worker co-op movement in New York City, and we are growing a movement in Connecticut as well. We have other co-op housing and worker co-op pieces coming into place as well in Connecticut. And so we're just a state over, and I would love to see the intersection grow between both, but I think we're in a really promising moment for housing co-ops and worker co-ops, especially, to come together, and for the labor movement to be a sort of linchpin of both of that. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, thank you all so much for those amazing presentations. Yeah. If I can kind of connect a few threads that I'm hearing, we have these systems in place that are kind of based on extraction and domination and exploitation. And we have a rich kind of hidden history of resistance and community empowerment. And what really I see in the solidarity economy is a way to kind of unite these existing practices while building out new practices that kind of bring in the externalities that currently that's where the profit comes from, of not giving labor its true value and and exploiting natural resources. And through housing co-ops, worker co-ops, community gardens, care networks, and all these different ways of networking what we might call like the life economy, and which it stands in opposition to an economy based on extraction. So I think it's time to go into some questions. I see we have some nice questions in the Q&A section. And before we do that, I have a few questions. One question I want to put to each speaker. So I'm going to ask Jessica first. this idea of cooperative commonwealth or an alternative economy based on worker and community ownership emerges in the 19th century with unions like the Knights of Labor. And you see the union and co-op movement actually started as one. And this idea has been picked up since then by people like W.E.B. Du Bois and Fannie Lou Hamer. What about this idea has been so attractive over time? How does it relate to solidarity economy, and why is it still relevant today?
So great question. You know, I think it's so attractive because of some of the stuff you've actually heard from my co-panelists, right? It's a way to connect all the dots, right? So we're workers, yes, and you know, owning our own company, creating our own work, owning our own company with other people is a solution. But then even members of worker co-ops need a place to live, right? And so they need technically they need housing co-ops, you know, because you know housing is as commodified as everything else and is in the speculative market, right? And we need healthy food, so we need healthy food, you know, co-ops to address healthy food. So if you look at every aspect of our life, right, we kind of need a co-op in each sector to address it, and that's what the co-op commonwealths do, right? It says, okay, you know, wherever you start, if you start with the Knights of Labor vision in the 1880s, right, they first started with union organizing and controlling work, but then they said, no, we need to own our own workplaces, right? But then you need a place to live. So then we need to own, you know, we need to collectively own, we need co-op housing, social housing, community land trust, whatever for living. We need food co-ops, we need health care co-ops, we need you know, just go down the credit unions, right? We need access to extractive finance and financial services, and right. So we need credit unions and co-op banks. So if you think about every aspect of our life, we're really you know, capitalism has permeated everything we do, and so now we need to figure out ways. Instead of demutualizing, which is what capitalism does, we need to decapitalize, right? And so thinking about these interlocking systems, right? So we need supply chains, right? Cooperative, collective supply chains. We need to interlock using co-ops in each of the areas of our lives. And so that's where this notion of a cooperative commonwealth comes to play. It also helps us to address the issue of isolation, right? A lot of times there's just one co-op isolated in a city, in a community, that everything else is capitalist again. So you still have, right, you're still kind of competing with capitalism. You haven't really gotten out of the system. But if you have this notion of a commonwealth, or now we're also talking about co-op ecosystems, right? Again, it's the same notion that you use a co-op to address all the issues of human survival. Co-op solidarity, right? And then the ecosystem, the commonwealth is a solidarity system, right? It's a system where all these things work together, interlock each other, supply each other, but are connected with the same values, right? And those values, as we all keep articulating, are about human dignity, human worth, non-exploitative, right? Non-hierarchical. And so you have a whole system that works under that. And slowly I kind of have been using a blizzard metaphor now, right? We can start with a few snowflakes, right? We can start with a co-op here or there. A little more snow comes down. We have a few more co-ops. We interlock some of them, but eventually, hopefully, and quietly, right? You know, the snow comes down enough in a blizzard, it covers everything. And it can subsume, take over, and replace capitalism. So I think that's sort of the notion of these co-op commonwealths. And obviously they're needed more now than ever. Because we also need to protect the earth, right? And protect Mother Nature. And we can't do that through capitalism either. Again, the solidarity cooperative economics is what's going to help us address environmental justice issues as well.
Yeah, thank you so much. And kind of moving towards, bringing these things together and thinking of unions and co-ops. I wanted to ask Shaywaal, how is you represent you brought up cooperative home care associates and you represent them as a union rep. How is it different representing them as a worker-owned business, as a cooperative, compared to the other companies in at-home nursing that aren't cooperatively owned? What is the difference like for you in terms of like negotiations and from a labor perspective?
Well, Rob, actually, I do not represent CHCA, but I work with them now in terms of what we're doing to develop that model. However, what I will tell you is that CHCA started prior to the union coming in. There was a cooperative before the 1199 was voted in. The issues that I see that are really different are the Labor Management Corporation. That there are the shop floor issues that happen in everywhere, not just even in a cooperative, but happens in a privatized business. Human relationships are different, right? Worker owners are able to talk to each other to resolve the issue before it spills over. That both the worker owners and management sit down and discuss the issues around that it's affecting their ability to get more clients, the ability to talk about training for the worker owners, for the 1199 members in CHCA. That is also a big deal because they get to train so they have a career ladder. But what I wanted to talk a little bit about, Robert, and just to sort of bring it back to the idea of how do the employer, how do we as unions talk with or how we relate to the co-op movement, if I could, is that basically I believe that we need to push for our movement to go back into the schools. Start teaching labor history in elementary school. Start teaching labor relations in high school. Start talking about labor history, right? And so what can we do as co-ops and unions in this modern time? I say that as Eugene Victor Debs would do, is to take the tools of the capitalists. They have the social media. Let's start using podcasts. Let's start using the ability of the internet to speak to our brothers and sisters in Germany and getting their in Japan. What are their positives? What has worked for them and what has not worked? How do we develop a relationship in the American landscape that could reflect a global idea? How do we do that? By setting up, I call it pilot projects within our workplace through language, what I call cultural integration. That the Asian worker or the Mexican or the Spanish worker can relate to the African worker. What is it? Through food, through music, through the ability of art. Perhaps that's another way that we can talk to each other to start to develop a community attachment. And so that I'll end up as that. But in terms of CHCA, it is a special relationship that is no different. By the way, CHCA is not treated, and which is one of my pushes, that CHCA is not treated differently from any other employer. And that's an issue, right? Meaning that they have to go to bat in Albany, that CHCA has to go to bat with the premiers and the visiting nurses and these companies that have massive purses. And we want to pull this idea of CHCA aside and say, look at this model. Why not use this to build our communities, to build our infrastructure when it comes to healthcare, but also to make sure that we have anchor in terms of profit sharing and governance within the workplace. And so that's the difference.
Thank you. And yeah, I want to encourage everyone to post questions in the chat. I'm gonna give one to Alex, which actually I see Yvonne kind of asked for me there. So I appreciate that, Yvonne. And the question, so you wrote an article in Roar magazine called Municipalist Syndicalism, in which you say that the point of production is now the community. I want to ask you to elaborate on that point. And how can the one big union syndicalist approach create meaningful alternatives to the kind of broken system that we have now?
Yeah, so what I was getting at there was, and actually it's sort of highlighted by the history with NVP, is that we've moved away from a mass production manufacturing economy. It's not to say that isn't there are elements of it there, but um um, we have a very service-based economy, and so a lot of what work looks like is working with other people, servicing other people. There is the growth of the care economy, which is only going to keep growing, and as we've heard, is quite short-staffed. And so when we look at that, or when we just think of that from a very bird's eye view, we have to think about what are the political opportunities that are latent within that, and what are the political opportunities that are latent within that is that the ability for people to actually speak with one another, the ability for people to connect in a community-wide level in ways that are now newly opened up. And so when we look at the success of the Chicago Teachers Union or the United Teachers of Los Angeles or other sort of bargaining for the common good approaches that are also very much rooted in very disciplined, structured, workplace-based organizing. What we see is a real sort of intentionality in connecting with parents and connecting with surrounding communities and mobilizing that. And so you're starting to get there to sort of a class-based movement at that point. It's not simply a sort of meeting of distinct special interests. It's a coming together of demands that then transform into community-wide and class-wide demands, and ones that reach across class, race, and gender, or across segments of class and across race and gender. And so that's sort of that's where this comes together in terms of thinking about it in terms of one big union. And the way I talk about it in that article is he's not just sort of like one big union of labor, but one big union of labor and tenants. And the reason why I bring it up that way is not sort of some kind of like mythical image, though myths help in our organizing, but and I mean that in a very positive sense. Um, what I mean by that is that we have, especially again, if we think about this, and again, coming back to the Northeast, where a lot of us are where the three panelists here are based in, we kind of are in this deadlock. Like we have this every year. I see this in almost every state where we have big pushes in the legislature. We have big pushes around financing, around taxation, around what have you. And the question is, okay, when you're sort of in this deadlock for years, what do you do? And one thing you could do is you could open up another front. And that's where organizing tenants really matters. And it's also a gateway into how do we organize more workers? Because I'll give you an example. When I organized a tenants union in New Haven, one of them is called Blake Street Tenants Union. We got to collective bargaining agreement. Very exciting that this happened. One of the things that was very promising was that about, I don't know, a third of the complex was union members, and the other two-thirds wasn't. And we'd have these really exciting sort of moments where you'd see that sort of cross-pollinate. And all of a sudden, you're giving people who maybe previously were never in a union before, labor or tenants union, hearing the experiences and hearing the very real reasoning and possibilities for why it is that we can win and why it is that actually this is ours already. And we just need to formalize that this is ours. And so the notion of one big union of tenants, of labor, of both together, is to open up that possibilities first through the imaginations of people, second through the actual experiences of people jointly held together, and then through what it opens up politically in terms of alignments and realignments, and how what was previously just not even thought of as a concept actually is very much not just a concept, but as a driving force in moving forward. And I think that's where you get back, that's where you get directly into co-ops, especially when we're talking about with housing right now, where we are in such a crisis point that is only going to get worse. I mean, if you look at predictions, I mean, institutional investors within a matter of years are predicted to control about 40% of single family homes in this country. And this is only going up and up and up. If you look at federal policies such as opportunity zones, that I wouldn't be surprised might be related to what Shaywaal was just talking about in terms of driving. Okay, we're going to hold onto an asset, and then past a certain point, we get full capital gains tax break. That is such a that is another sort of piece here in terms of priming the pump for this kind of real estate speculation. And so this is likely only going to get worse. And so within the backdrop of that, one big union of workers and tenants is sort of a notion of like, okay, you know what? We need to make our own moves and we need to come together in our own ways. And we're actually only just by the material dynamics of this moment are going to arrive at, you know what is a solution? Cooperative ownership and support structures for cooperative ownership.
Yeah, thank you. And before bringing Shaywaal and Jessica back in, I want to just follow up with a question from David Cobb, who's a good friend. And he asks, how can we best engage in electoral politics to advance the solidarity economy without becoming pawns of the neoliberal Democratic Party establishment? You've brought up policy a few times, so just in terms of thinking about policy or electoral politics, what's your thinking? What's your thinking there? And then we'll get back to Jessica and Shaywaal.
I mean, it's a good question. I have to say it's a very hard question, having been involved in electoral politics in the past and thinking about this a lot myself, because there have been a lot of attempts, I think, over the last few years to try and figure this out. And I really think what we need to be doing right now is building up a kind of third force that can interact with this kind of component in our landscape. But I think we have a lot of work to do with base building first. I think if we don't do the base building, we're not going to be able to actually adequately even talk through that question. And that's what we really lacked in a lot of ways. And that's another reason why it comes back to, for me, as I wrote about years ago now, one big union of tenants and workers is like, okay, how are we sort of recalibrating our notion of base building that maybe takes us to a newfound sort of arrival in terms of electoral politics or political points and so forth. And so I mean, it's a good question. But I think base building is where it's at. And I mean, one of the things is that NVP, we don't engage in electoral politics. And so I'm in ways I'm very happy that our focus is just the base building right now, and the work that we're doing.
Thank you. And I see that Jessica, you've responded to a few comments in the questions. So if you wanted to, I'll give you an opportunity to, say anything about those, or I could pass you another question from the unanswered question so far. If you,
yeah, hopefully the people who asked the questions that I typed an answer to can look at those, and I think I answered them. So I guess we could move on
sure.
to some of the ones I didn't answer, though there was one that I thought could have been jointly answered, which was the one about AI and solidarity economics. I gave my thoughts about it.
Okay,
But
I can.
right, yeah. So I don't know if other people want to say, but I was saying with worker control of our own worker co-ops, we can kind of create work and overcome what's happening with capitalists controlling AI, but there's probably more to say about that one.
Yeah, I can read that one out loud. So Ariana asks, how does solidarity economy and economics of abundance address the rise of AI? Massive job losses coming from the result of tech and increasing consolidation of wealth. So if Shaywaal or Alex want to tackle that one.
I might want to just pass it off to Alex. Could you read that question again one more time? I'm trying to look in terms of is that the last question?
Yeah, it's like, how does
it's already answered. Yeah, I answered it, so it went over into answered. It's instead of an open question, you need to click the tab on answered questions.
Yeah, it's kind of on how solidarity economy can avert the coming massive unemployment caused by AI and the continuing consolidation of wealth.
So for me, I'll just take it from a healthcare perspective, then I'll turn it to Alex. I believe that healthcare is going to be more of a rise in employment. There's a need. I think that technology in the workplace will also have an effect. But AI, when we deal in the human services industry, in terms of it, whether it be in healthcare in particular nursing homes, we need workers. We need to train the workers on with our training fund how to operate the machines, how to operate the computers, which we do already. And so in terms of whether there be now the hospitals may be a whole different conversation. But in my sphere, I believe that the AI development and internal layoffs or closures is not happening. It's actually in healthcare, it's the opposite. It's expanding. It's just a matter of now how we look at it. Technology with home care, as a matter of fact, now there are operators that are, they train their workers to go into houses with an iPad where the client puts their hand, a palm reading, and all their information comes up. And so the employee themselves have to learn how to operate the machine. And that's only going to become more and more and more of a daily work standard or a daily work doing. And so that I don't see as, although in other industries it will, but in terms of healthcare, in terms of long-term care in particular, I believe there's going to be a need, a rise of hiring and promoting that particular type of work.
Yeah, I agree with what Shaywaal said and what Jessica wrote in response in the written response. I do think, I mean, this only highlights why we need more cooperative ownership and cooperative control so that decisions can be made by those who are affected by this. Also, there is a very funny conundrum in all this, or a very sort of funny contradiction. There's a kind of dissonance that I just can't get over and over again. On the one hand, we have always this looming question about the loss of jobs, and on the other hand, especially coming out of the labor movement and working directly in the labor movement still, constantly hear about short staffing in all sorts of sectors, and um, there are there are many jobs already out there, and there are many more jobs we could have. The question we should ask is like, why are we not adequately investing in them? And what are the decisions that are making us not adequately invest in them or even divesting from them? And healthcare is one of those sectors, schools and education. I mean, it's so interesting where also I see locally sometimes here, um, oh, a certain school has seen a drop in the school population. So is it time to close it? Why is it not a conversation to actually reduce class size? I mean, we do this constantly where we talk about how there's going to be a loss of jobs in X arena, but then in another area, day to day, we're just constantly hearing about either short staffing or about reasons why, because there is some sort of drop in the population being serviced, that is now an excuse to actually take away jobs. So I think we need to actually. I don't think this is just like a discursive, fluffy point. I think this is something that we need to explore more and go deeper in driving language and advocacy through so that we can alter the terms of this conversation. Because again, you name even the public sector job here in Connecticut, and I can tell you numbers on really stark numbers on short staffing that are affecting a lot of people here in Connecticut and are also affecting people being adequately serviced.
Right. And some of that short staffing, when they first started talking about it, the second or third years of COVID, it was really, to me, it was a mark that people were now saying, I'm not going to work that horrible job. I'd rather stay home, right? I don't want a job that's not going to protect me, that's not going to pay me well, right? Puts me on the front lines, but gives me no support, right? I'd rather not work, right? So part of the issue about short staffing or the lack of jobs is because we don't control our own work. We don't, right? We're not making decisions about the common good and what would be good for society and for each of us as human laborers, right? The decisions are outside of us. So again, if we decommodify, if we decapitalize, then there's not going to be a shortage of labor. There's not going to be a shortage of things to do, especially if we start treating labor properly and and labor gets to control what we do, how we do it, what's get paid, what are the work rules, that kind of thing.
Yeah, thank you so much on that one. So I want to turn to a question Michelle asked, and I kind of want to flip it around a little bit. Michelle asked, how will the solidarity economy survive active attempts to sabotage from capitalist fund institutions? And I think right now, I think capitalist institutions kind of see us as so periphery that, like, I don't know how much sleep they're losing right now about it. But I want to bring up a point that you made, Jessica, about W.E.B. Du Bois saying how revolt, insurrection, and cooperation were all collaborative or are all connected. So I want to ask a little bit about how solidarity economy kind of confronts and takes a confrontational standpoint, because in some ways I see solidarity economy, people who promote it are like, well, we're building up these institutions on the side. And I don't know, I mean, I'm kind of put this to you all, whether we think that we can kind of build up these institutions through the various, networks that we currently have, and how can we start, or at what point does that solidarity economy take that confrontational stance with the status quo? So I'll put that up to Jessica or whoever wants to take on that one.
Well, I can start. I've definitely documented a lot of sabotage, especially against Black co-ops through history. What I also noticed and learned was that even though it's not foolproof and the sabotage had been, has seriously curtailed some of the activities, the co-ops that survived the sabotage were very connected to their community. So back to the need for solidarity economics, right? They were very connected to their communities. The co-ops that survived were connected to strong Black organizations that were there to help support them, whether it was with education or financial issues. They were well connected to their communities. So the communities, when they knew it was a co-op, they would help the co-op by either patronizing it, being a customer, or sometimes literally taking guns and standing in front of the co-op with the guns to protect the co-op, right? So there is a level of that, that integration. The co-ops can't be isolated, right? The community needs to know that it's a co-op, why it's a co-op, what the values are. The community needs to see it as integral to the co-op, and that's something they want to survive. That helps a huge amount. And then these interconnections and creating more solidarity ecosystems and commonwealths, that's also part of why those are successful and so necessary, because those are what also help to protect, right? If a bank is sabotaging a co-op or a set of co-ops because they won't give a loan or they won't give a line of credit, well, go to a credit union, create a credit exchange, right? So there's things, a lot of the solidarity economy, cooperative economic stuff that have actually developed to get around the fact that capitalism won't either allow it or won't support it. And so I think it's that kind of, it's almost a chicken and egg, right? The more we have the solidarity systems in place, the stronger the co-ops and the other activities can be. And and the more the individual co-ops connect with other groups, have those connections, the stronger they can get and the more they can develop the whole movement.
Yeah, I agree with that, and it's something I wrote about for my dissertation was on a public school in New Haven that from 1970 to 2015 was run basically as a worker co-op, and for a period joint teacher community controlled, and that actually was in part informed by the experiences of Ocean Hill Brownsville in New York City about the need for joint teacher community control. That's a whole other thing I could talk about, but basically there were moments in those 45 years where there were attempts to actually just dissolve the structure, completely alter it, because the central office didn't like that structure, and many others didn't like that structure. And the reason why it was preserved was actually very much because of the interconnectedness between that school, it's called High School in the Community, and the New Haven Federation of Teachers. And for a long period, the New Haven Teachers Union was very pro this model and even attempting to create more cooperatively run public schools. And there was actually a second one created as sort of laid by the groundwork from high school and the community. And so whenever there were attempts, one year, for example, there was an attempt to just appoint the principal, no consulting with the teachers, no consulting with the parents, students. They've rapidly mobilized and prevented that from happening and could retain their structure. And so it's absolutely, this brings us back to like, to exactly, again, like the exact theme of this this panel and event, solidarity economy and labor. That was that was one moment, and there were others in the history of just that high school where, because the union and the co-op were connected, they were able to amplify the power of each other. And so I think that some of the sort of the word sabotage makes sense. There are very sort of and I see it in a variety of ways, and it's a whole also a whole other thing where it's very important that we have these support structures, or that we have adjoining structures, because one of the issues about being isolated as a co-op, what Jessica was alluding to, is that you are very much open to attack from others, and it's not going to be necessarily, oh, we hate co-ops. Sometimes it is, believe it or not, but it could be in other ways in which there is an attempt to sort of put resources elsewhere and promote another model, or promote the traditional model as opposed to the co-op one. And it is extremely racialized, and it is extremely based on sort of condescension and believing that people can't do it themselves, even though people very much can. And I mean, here's the thing that I think we need to think about too. I mean, capitalist businesses have all sorts of support structures. There are business associations, there are chambers of commerce, there are lines of credit that are open, there are relationships. For some reason, we have this belief, or there's this mainstream belief, that, oh, co-ops don't work. You know, look at this failure over here, look at that failure over there. And then usually, especially when you look in this country, when you dig in, you find, where were the support structures there? And often they just weren't, and people burn out, and burnout leads to heavy conflict, and you find implosions. And that actually doesn't have to be the case. There are actually plenty of examples of the opposite. And that's where again, the co-op movement, the labor movement can be really important to each other.
Yeah, thank you so much for that one. And I want to lift up a question from Dylan Hatch. I see you answered it in the Shaywaal, you answered it. I want to give you a chance to talk on this one. Dylan says, I'm curious to hear more about what the U.S. labor movement can learn from the union co-op solidarity in other countries, and just union co-ops in general, kind of following on what Alex was just saying, and kind of the points of how can unions as a support system, whether through worker solidarity or through the resources and assets of unions, how can that support co-op development? So I'll put that to Shaywaal and give everyone a chance if they want to just speak.
So we have expansive 1199, a large training fund that does a lot of training on workplace issues, on language, that we can utilize on a broader basis, even within our communities. And we have stretched in terms of it because it's a labor management project that it's not necessarily limited to just unionized workforce. Also, the non-unionized workforce and management sometimes have access to this training fund. So what we're trying to do is to partner with them to look at the broader picture. As a matter of fact, there are a few experiments that we in 1199 over a period of last 15 years or so, which was called person-centered care, creating teams within the nursing homes where they create their own scheduling, they create their own budgets for the residents, and also it created an issue, by the way, which is a plus and a challenge as well, where the teams themselves, one person may have been a universal worker. Let's just put it this way, where they had 3 different skills in one, but they were in a particular small house concept, whereby they were either cooks, they clean, or they took care of the residents themselves on one-on-ones. And they would change around based upon who was more, in terms of who was a better chef, or who was a better cook, or who was better able to deal with the resident. And so the workers themselves made those determinations. We still have that in 2 of our places, in particular at the place called the Plaza and a place called Sarah Newman in Westchester, which is the Jewish Home Network, Life Care Network. And so those were experiments that we started up several years ago that actually we want to bring, in the near future to open it up. It's called the small house concept. In terms of the political idea, the 1199 also has influence on a state and on a city level, whereby we endorse and we interview workers, politicians through the workers themselves, our members interview and vet these particular people running for office. So that's another way that we can actually influence the process. To me, it comes down to anchor in healthcare. Anchor in healthcare within our communities. I see what is happening with the big networks, the Presbyterians, the New York hospitals, the Mount Sinai's. They are going into our communities and extracting the capital, and we do not have an answer. Creating community centers, creating these urgent cares, and again, they are non-union workers. And we need to then now, and from an organizing perspective, begin through the community, the East New Yorks and the Brownsvilles and the South Bronx, to start developing where the workers in the community itself starts to organize those workers and starts to talk about why it's important to have the union as well as a cooperative idea. And how we do that is to go in there, anchor the conversation, let it come from the workers, not from the 1199, quote unquote, the union guy coming in, but from their perspective, getting their issues and getting their particular way to move their community and what is best for them. So that is another way of doing it in terms of what we're trying to do at this point.
Yeah,
Yeah.
another model, which I guess we haven't mentioned yet for union co-ops, is the co-op Cincy model. They're also doing a great job of connecting co-op development, worker development, and union support and unionization. And they've got a bunch of, again, interlocking co-op businesses. They have a co-op education program. I think they have a community college curriculum. They also do other trainings, but again, everything's connected to labor owning their work, dignity of labor, and working together and having that support from the union movement, as well as they've got some green industries too. So I think there's lots of ways we can think about this. One of my favorite union co-ops was Lusty Ladies. So they also have some examples of co-ops, worker co-ops that started with a union drive, and then they realized that being unionized wasn't actually enough, right? So Lusty Ladies, a peep show of women dancers in San Francisco, unionized. They won their union fight. Their employer decided to sell the business because he didn't want a union peep show. They realized they could buy it, so they bought the business, co-owners with the bouncers and the janitors, right? So a really nice coalition of labor, and ran their own peep show for, I don't know, probably 10 to 12 years. Unfortunately, gentrification and the rise in rent pushed them out. So I think in that model, maybe owning their own building or being in a land trust might have helped them, but it was really a fascinating model. And for the 12 years they were in existence, that again, connection to being the labor, the empowerment as doing organized labor, and that empowerment also leading you to realize you could run your own company, you could do it the way you need to, and then having your union provide some background support. Some of the unions also provide the health care and other benefits that a small worker co-op can't do on its own. So I think there's lots of nice combinations and connections and models to use.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I saw Vivian was raising her hand, as a classmate. If you want to put your question in the chat, we are running out of time, so I can put that, if Vivian, I can put your question to the panelists afterwards, if you get it in the chat or email me. So I see we're nearing time, so I want to give you all a kind of chance to have a final word, but I see two questions here. Jerome and Eric have kind of related questions about scale and kind of maybe thinking about what envisioning like how we can build this up is a good way to kind of end the panel, and thinking about kind of what this looks like if we're successful, and when we're successful, and when we start really like building this up and contending. So if if y'all want to talk about visions for kind of the macroeconomic coordination, and then say any last words, and we'll end it from there. So
I think I have two responses to that. One is one is a lame one, which is I think the more that we grow a sector, the more that we'll arrive at real, actual, concrete answers to that. I think it's very hard to say what it should look like or what it can look like exactly. This is sort of a kind of, I think, the make the road as we walk it kind of scenario. But I also think there are historical examples to draw on. I mean, there are the examples, for example, there is, I mean, Yugoslavia had worker self-management for 40, 45 years. It's not something that's talked about a lot. There is a very big literature on it. And there are examples like, and there are others. It's not just that, it's just one that comes to mind right now. But we can look to actual historical examples to see that. And some of it might not be very relevant. I mean, 1970s, 1960s Yugoslavia might not be might not be as parallel to our situation right now in certain ways. It might be in certain situations. I mean, when we think about a sort of multi-ethnic, federalized state, I mean, there are strong parallels in that way. And so I think it is a combination though of being schooled on when it's happened, what it's looked like, what didn't work, what were sort of the conflicts, and how those were sort of how those conflicts were rooted in certain different forms and arrangements of power. And then I think it is very much, until we start building a sector, I don't think we will have a very much of any kind of a sense of what the actual answer is, or what the answers should be in the moment that we live in.
I think it makes sense to try to get enabling laws now. I don't think we'll be that successful, as people have said. I don't think it hurts to keep trying, and a lot of legal policy strategy has been about years of just continuing to offer the bill, right, and try. But what really makes sense and is exciting in terms of enabling legislation side is, once you have what do you call it? I just lost the term. More and more co-ops and solidarity economic activity. So people are practicing it and seeing as they practice it what support they need from government, what policy supports they need. To me, it more authentically bubbles up when you have more and more people who are saying, oh, now I know why we need that kind of a law, or we need that kind of a law because my housing co-op, my community land trust, my worker co-op, we had this problem, or we had this, right? And so I think when we've got more, I don't know what is that word? More, I keep saying bubbling up, but there's another word for when you
critical
get,
mass.
yes, critical mass. Thank you. When you get more critical mass, I think then you get both the power of collective action, but you also get people who honestly understand why these policies are needed and are more willing to put their bodies to get those policies done. So I think that's part of it. But also, my great example in the 1880s with the Knights of Labor, they did a legislative strategy in Richmond in 1885, I think it was, which is really interesting. They the new city hall was going to be built, and the previous existing city council was going to use convict labor to build it, and non-unionized labor, etc. And so they ran a campaign for unionized labor, for their co-ops to get the jobs, for their integrated and co-ed co-ops to get the job, and unionized labor to get the job to build the city hall. They ran candidates and they won. The majority of their candidates won. They took over the city council and hired, organized labor and their co-ops to build what's the existing Richmond City Hall. So it's a really interesting strategy, and they did it under segregation. So their Black chapters had to meet separately, organize and mobilize separately than their white chapters, and they still were able to get white and black city council members elected on their platform. So really, it can be done. That's the 1880s, one of the most repressive periods in our history, or post-slavery repressive periods in our history, and yet it was done, and done in the right way.
I believe as Alex has said, I think it's important. In order to make a movement, we have to go back to the start, and that's to go back into the communities. That's to take it from to the workers themselves, to push the legislatures to make it happen. And without that, it's not going to happen in terms of a movement, a national movement. And one of our strategies is to actually invite some of the Bronx politicians to talk to us this coming week in Co-op City about their take on the solidarity economy. And we've invited Jamal Bailey, and we've invited several others who have actually, by the way, pushed state legislation around co-op development. So we want to be able to have our members tell them this is what we need, and that's how change starts happening. But it has to go back in terms of organizing, educating, and organizing and agitating, and that's how we're going to start building this movement. And so that's why I think the co-op adopt the co-op idea is to start where they're pushing it from that level, but where the residents of Co-op City determines where their issues are, not me or anyone else on the outside. They build from there.
Yep.
All right. Well, that seems like a pretty good spot to leave it. We're at 6 o'clock now, so I want to thank all these wonderful panelists for sharing, and I really appreciate everything that you've all been saying. And thank you all for coming. This has been an excellent discussion. And I'm really excited about this movement that we're building, and the prospect. Even though we're facing a major multidimensional crisis, I think that people are coming with some really creative and meaningful alternatives to start building up a future that we all deserve. So, thank you all so much, and have a great night.